For nearly 600 years, London killed people at the same spot and called it justice. It is a terrifying realization that for nearly 6 centuries, the rhythm of London life included a centralized, institutionalized place for state-sanctioned murder, a cycle of life-ending routine that persisted through wars, plagues, and dynastic changes, all while being sanctioned under the lofty, often contradictory banner of justice, revealing a dark, enduring truth about the nature of power and social control through public violence. These videos are not for everyone. If you want to understand power, history, and reality, then subscribe. Near today's Marble Arch, men once died screaming in front of cheering crowds. If you stand near the familiar hustle of Marble Arch today, you are standing on ground where, for centuries, the air was thick with the scent of fear and the sound of final, desperate screams. A place where the dying faced not sober officials, but vast, often drunken crowds who had gathered, specifically to witness the agonizing final moments of men condemned, turning human tragedy into a grotesque, celebratory spectacle. This place executed people before America even existed, long before the foundation of Jamestown or Plymouth or the revolutionary ideas that would define the modern era across the Atlantic. This particular patch of ground was already soaked in the history of state violence, confirming its position not just as a location for execution, but as a deeply entrenched ritual site whose antiquity speaks volumes about the enduring, primal nature of justice systems rooted in immediate, visible retribution. In 1196, Tyburn began a tradition of public death that lasted generations. It was in the late 12th century, a time when Richard the Lionheart was still navigating the Crusades and the feudal system was deeply entrenched, that the practice of public execution took root at Tyburn, initiating an unbroken, terrifying tradition that would weave itself into the fabric of London's history, creating a terrifying legacy that outlasted dozens of monarchs and profoundly shaped the psychological landscape of the city for over half a millennium. This wasn't punishment. It was a public warning. The severity and visibility of the acts performed here transcended mere retribution for a crime committed. They were carefully choreographed, theatrical displays designed not to simply punish the individual, but to broadcast a universal, chilling message to the masses, ensuring that every citizen understood the definitive, horrific cost of straying from the prescribed social order. Thousands gathered like it was a festival to watch men die. The sheer scale of the crowds was astonishing, often rivaling the numbers seen at major fairs or public holidays, highlighting how deeply integrated the act of witnessing death had become into the social and cultural life of the time, where families packed picnic baskets and vendors sold souvenirs, participating in a macabre holiday where the primary entertainment was the extinguishing of human life. Prisoners were dragged through London streets before their execution. The journey itself was an integral, humiliating part of the ritual, known as the Dead Cart Procession, where the condemned were hauled on open carts from Newgate Prison through the bustling, jeering streets of London, transforming their final hours into a highly visible parade of shame designed to maximize both the spectacle and the psychological impact on both the prisoner and the onlookers. They even stopped for drinks on the way to the gallows. It is recorded that this grim procession often included a customary stop at certain taverns, most famously the Bull House, where the condemned would be given a final, large tankard of ale, a paradoxical moment of human pity injected into an otherwise merciless ritual, providing a brief, jarring pause between the world of the living and the looming finality of the gallows. Fear was not hidden at Tyburn, it was displayed. Unlike modern justice systems that shield the act of execution behind high walls and clinical procedures, the system operating at Tyburn demanded that fear be front and center, using the visible terror and suffering of the condemned individual as the primary instructional tool for maintaining societal compliance and reinforcing the absolute, unchallengeable authority of the Crown and the law. One structure could hang 24 people at the same time. The scale of the Tyburn tree, the enormous, unique triangular structure used for mass executions, was designed for maximum efficiency and psychological horror, capable of dispatching 24 souls simultaneously, underscoring the industrial nature of this state violence and ensuring that the public witnessed an overwhelming, unforgettable spectacle of mortality. They called it the Tyburn tree, but it bore human bodies, not fruit. The infamous name itself speaks to the dark mockery and macabre humor of the era, referencing the triple gallows design that stood permanently at the junction, suggesting a perversion of nature where the structure, instead of yielding life, bore the swinging, lifeless forms of condemned men and women, standing as a constant, stark monument to death on the city's western edge. In one day alone, 24 men were executed together. The sheer bureaucratic efficiency of death was sometimes fully realized, as documented on days where the gallows were entirely utilized, such as the famous Great Hanging Day, ensuring that a mass clearance of condemned prisoners was conducted in a single afternoon, maximizing the terrifying impact and making an unequivocal statement about the state's absolute power to enforce its laws swiftly and collectively. Another day, more than 40 people died before sunset. While the standard gallows held 24, certain extraordinary days, often during periods of acute social unrest or following large-scale roundups, necessitated additional temporary setups, pushing the daily death toll even higher, sometimes exceeding 40 individuals, demonstrating the capacity of the legal system to unleash concentrated, relentless carnage when politically or socially expedient. Famous criminals, rebels, and symbols of resistance all ended here. Tyburn's ledger of the dead includes not only petty thieves and highwaymen, but also figures who briefly shook the foundations of power, from Catholic martyrs who refused to renounce their faith to notable pirates and famous highwaymen like Jack Sheppard, establishing the location as the ultimate neutral ground where political dissent and common crime met the same violent, inescapable end. Even powerful men were not safe from this rope. Despite the perception that the gallows were primarily for the lowest classes, the spectacle occasionally claimed individuals from positions of significant standing, such as in the execution of the powerful plotter and statesman Roger Mortimer, Earl of March, in 1330, proving that political miscalculation or rivalry could override social status, leading even the most influential figures to the common death reserved for criminals. Some were executed years after death, just to make a point. The reach of state vengeance extended beyond the grave, exemplified by the macabre practice of posthumous execution, where the already buried remains of traitors, like those involved in regicide, were exhumed, dragged to Tyburn, publicly hanged, and then often beheaded and quartered, ensuring that the symbolic punishment and the explicit warning were delivered, regardless of whether the physical body felt the pain. Women weren't spared. Some were burned alive for treason. The law reserved particular, horrific forms of death for women convicted of high treason, often substituting the standard hanging for burning at the stake, as this was legally considered a more decent form of execution for the female body, a brutal distinction that ensured that women, despite their lesser political status, faced equally, if not more, terrifying public demises. Others were torn apart after hanging, piece by piece. The gruesome ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering, reserved for male high treason, ensured that death was not a clean ending. After being hanged until nearly dead, the victim was cut down, disemboweled while possibly still conscious, and then, finally, dismembered, providing a horrifying, visceral demonstration of absolute judicial wrath upon the symbolic destruction of the king's authority. Death didn't end at the gallows. Bodies were dissected like objects. The end of the hanging was often the beginning of another grim phase, as the bodies of criminals were often legally given to the Royal College of Surgeons for public dissection, a secondary punishment designed to deny the deceased a Christian burial and turn their corpse into a clinical lesson, further reducing the executed individual to a warning object for both the populace and the medical profession. The crowd laughed, drank, and treated it as entertainment. The behavior of the gathered thousands often defied modern sensibilities, treating the executions as an outing filled with raucous behavior, drinking, shouting, and trading gossip, a normalization of violence that allowed the public to compartmentalize the suffering into mere spectacle, proving how easily human life can be devalued when codified within a system of fear-based law. Violence became normal when law ruled through fear. When the primary tool of legal enforcement is the highly visible, brutal destruction of human life, society inevitably absorbs that violence, integrating it into its daily routine, demonstrating a chilling historical pattern where the state's reliance on terror inevitably fosters a general coarsening of public morality, and a diminished respect for life itself. Tyburn trained society to obey, or suffer, publicly. Every execution was a meticulously staged lesson in submission, a powerful, continuous conditioning mechanism that ingrained into the population the stark, binary choice: adhere strictly to the rules of the established order, or face a public, agonizing fate that served as a final, unforgettable testament to the absolute power wielded by the governing authorities. Justice here was slow, brutal, and intentional. The process, from the initial cart ride to the calculated delays and the final drop, was anything but swift. It was a deliberately protracted, vicious affair, ensuring that every step of the punishment, the journey, the spectacle, the pain, and the final breath was maximized for its deterrent effect, leaving nothing to chance in its horrifying instructional intent. The rich watched safely, the poor paid with their lives. While the spectacle drew crowds from all social strata, the overwhelming majority of those who faced the rope were the impoverished, the desperate, and the politically marginalized, highlighting the fundamental class asymmetry of the justice system, where those with economic privilege could afford safety and observation, while those without often paid the ultimate, public price for petty crimes driven by necessity. This was power without restraint. The sheer longevity and brutality of the Tyburn tradition represents a profound historical example of absolute state power operating with unchecked impunity, defining the era where the government's right to inflict ultimate public suffering was unquestioned, standing as a stark reminder of the dangers inherent when the mechanisms of justice are solely focused on deterrence through terror, rather than rehabilitation or true equity. Artists later captured this cruelty because it shocked even them. Though executions were routine, the grotesque theater still held a morbid fascination for intellectuals and artists of the time, leading to numerous detailed illustrations and literary accounts, such as Hogarth's work, which, while documenting the event, subtly underscored the inherent societal cruelty and the terrifying debasement that the ritual inflicted upon the human condition, even for those accustomed to it. Tyburn wasn't just a gallows, it was a message. It transcended its physical function as merely a tool for hanging. It was a political, social, and psychological nexus point, a continuous visual manifesto broadcasting the immutable laws of the crown and the permanent consequences for breaking them, ensuring that the site carried a symbolic weight far greater than the crimes committed there. A message written in rope, blood, and silence. The ultimate message delivered by Tyburn was not one of reasoned law or fairness, but a stark, primal narrative articulated through the rough hemp of the noose, the unmistakable sight of spilled human blood, and the final, crushing silence that descended when life departed. A truly elemental, terrifying form of communication that left no room for interpretation. This is where modern punishment learned its darkest lessons. The legacy of Tyburn echoes profoundly in the ongoing debates about criminal justice. It codified the reliance on extreme deterrence, the use of public shaming, and the systematic dehumanization of the condemned, setting precedents that continue to influence how societies approach punishment even, in systems that claim to be modern and enlightened. This video is created for educational and historical purposes. It examines themes of power, corruption, and human conflict, without depicting explicit or graphic events. Tell me in the comments, what did you feel the most? Once you know Tyburn, you'll never look at justice the same way again. Understanding the 6 centuries of brutal, theatrical execution that occurred in the middle of a major city fundamentally alters one's perception of the concept of law and order, stripping away any romantic notions and forcing a confrontation with the deeply uncomfortable historical reality of how justice has often functioned as a mechanism of control, rooted in fear and formalized public violence.